Hello, my name is Brian Donovan. I'm the Irish records expert here at Findmypast, and I'd like to give you an overview of what Irish records we have at Findmypast, because we have the largest collection in the world. Now, a lot of people know that Irish genealogy can be really difficult. Tracing family through the Irish records has been made so much more difficult by the destruction of records. The picture in front of you shows the explosion which incinerated the records in the Public Record Office in Dublin in June of 1922. This was a major calamity for archives in the country. It was the first opening salvo in the Irish Civil War. So, good thing to remember, don't start your civil war in the Public Record Office or in the major archive in the country, because it's going to make family history in the future almost impossible. But you know, often that awful tragedy is used as an excuse for why Irish genealogy isn't worth trying, because it's just too difficult. And yes, we did lose an awful lot, but we still have much surviving. So let's look at what we actually lost. In the explosion in 1922, we lost the 1821, 31, 41, and 1851 census returns. Now that's a big loss, and I'll talk a bit more about them later on. We also lost over 50% of the Church of Ireland parish registers. That was the established church, the main Protestant denomination. And that's also quite important for a variety of reasons, not just for tracing people who were Church of Ireland, but also the general community, because it was part of the state structure. We also lost a great deal of our wills and our court records. And on top of that, many other records, predominantly quite early records prior to 1700. So if you're lucky enough to have got back that far, well, then you probably don't even need to listen to this talk. But if not, there was a great tragedy there too. Other major calamities for Irish records include the 1861, 71, and 81, and 91 census returns, which were all destroyed by bureaucratic mistake. And I could give a separate talk just on that, but we don't have time today. On top of that, civil registration in Ireland starts quite late, in 1864, by comparison with England and Wales, which starts in the 1830s, or even Scotland in the 1850s. And that's kind of unusual, because most times when a new government idea came in, it was tried out in Ireland first. And if it worked, great, it was brought into England, and if it didn't work, it was dropped. Now, the image on your right-hand side is a picture of what the Public Record Office in Dublin looked like before it was destroyed. And it was a purpose-built archive, one of the best in Europe, so it was a tragedy. But what I want to talk about is the possibility and how easy Irish research is becoming. Is Irish research possible? Yes, it is. Now, one of the main reasons why we've been different from any other attempt to try and make Irish genealogy easier is because of a number of strategies we've employed. First and foremost, we've been trying to find new records, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about that, to try and replace the records that have been lost, and to also try and provide further stories and further information about the lives of your ancestors. We have the most comprehensive Irish record set anywhere. We have over 110 million records now, with over 300 million names. And we have a lot of other facilities on our site which make it easy to do your research, like building trees and finding hints to records. But the real core of why we're different is because we have a strong belief in partnership. We have extremely strong partnerships with the major cultural institutions in Dublin and in Britain and elsewhere around the world to make it possible for us to actually make Irish records easily available. We also have close partnerships with Irish local authority archives in Clare and Sligo and elsewhere, and also with other well-known genealogy organisations like Electoral in Ireland. So let's start with looking at what Irish record collections you have. When you come to Findmypast and you go to our A to Z of record sets, which you'll find in the menu items there, you might be completely overwhelmed by the huge breadth and scale of our collections. We have hundreds of collections in relation to Ireland. Now, I don't have time today to go through all of them, but what I want to do is try and focus your mind on how many good records there actually are, and also start looking at the opportunities offered by Irish research. We may have lost many record sets, but the administration in Ireland were obsessed with two key issues which have left greater records than any other country in the world. The government of Ireland is obsessed with land and security. Ireland was always the weak link into Britain, and they were obsessed with making sure that Ireland remained safe from invasion and assault by another hostile foreign European power, and also by rebellion within Ireland. And they were also obsessed by who controlled Ireland. So I'm going to start this talk by looking at records which you don't traditionally think of as being primary genealogy records. I'm going to start with land records, for example. Now, why are land records in Ireland so important? Well, I've mentioned we have a lot of them. But the first and most important land record is actually a tax record from the mid-19th century called the Griffith Valuation. Many of you may have come across this already because it's quite a well-known resource. It's our mid-19th century census substitute. Now, what it is a tax record for people paying the rates, as they were called. This was a new tax brought in to try and support this new social welfare system, which included workhouses, county homes, hospitals, and so on. And every occupier of land in Ireland, and actually occupier of houses, had to pay a tax every year. So this record gives you a list of all the occupiers of towns and land and houses, the people they paid rent to, and gives you some details about what they occupied, whether it was a house, whether it was what amount of land it was, whether they had outbuildings, whether they had a yard, and so on. So this is very useful. It covers the entire 32 counties of Ireland and has 1.4 million occupiers recorded. They also gathered detailed maps of where these locations were, and these are marked up versions of the Ordnance Survey maps if you're familiar with the Ordnance Survey maps, and we have these exclusively on Findmypast. But there are many other types of land records which were important and generated to try and facilitate the administration of Ireland. I want to touch on another one which I think is heavily underutilized, called the Landed Estate Court records. Now, what was the Landed Estate Court? Well, you'll all be familiar of the crisis of the famine in the mid-19th century in Ireland, where over 1 million people died and over 1 million people emigrated. That's 25% of the population. But it had another major effect as well, and one that the government was considerably more interested in dealing with, and that was that rents collapsed, so landlords were effectively bankrupt. Many of them were anyway. There's a whole range of reasons why they were in such financial destitution, as they felt at the time. But the major reason was that their income went down too low, and the amount of money they had to pay out through mortgages and marriage portions and all sorts of other costs that they may have had increasingly risen. So the government stepped in to help them out. Technically, every landlord only had a life interest in their land. The lands were in tail male, which meant that their eldest son would inherit, but they didn't have the right to sell. So therefore, they couldn't break out of their bankruptcy. So the government took control of their bankrupt estate, and what they did is they wrote off the debts or paid them, and then they sold the land under a special court system, this Landed Estate Court. And when they sold the land, and this is why we're interested, they produced detailed rentals of every estate. And we have over 8,000 estates were sold in this way, with over 500,000 tenants' names within these rentals. Now, they are doubly important, these rentals, because when an estate was sold, usually the original records for that estate were destroyed because they were no longer of any use. And so these are the only records we have. Now, why are they important for research? Well, they cover quite an early period. The Landed Estate Court is established effectively in 1848, right in the middle of the famine, and continues in operation up to the 1880s. So it's a relatively early time frame. But most importantly, it gives you records of the people who usually don't appear in records. Here's an example of one rental. You get a list of all the tenants' names, and you get a list of how much rent they pay, but you find out in the second last column the nature of their tenure, and each one of them is a tenant from year to year. They have no permanence of tenure, they have no lease. So these are really, in most cases, fairly marginal tenants with very few rights. These people don't leave records elsewhere, so it's very important. But beyond that, it's a breakthrough resource. It allows you to deal with the absence of other records. Some of you out there may be familiar with the Kearney family of Moneygall in County Offaly in Ireland. For those of you who aren't, the reason why they're significant is because these are the ancestors of President Obama, whose ancestors left Ireland in 1851. Well, Our partners in Enniclan trace that family way back to the 1690s, and the breakthrough resource for them to make it possible were the landed estate court records. Now I'm showing you one example here on the screen, but if you zoom in to find out that highlighted bit, we'll find out further information about why this is so important. Because this is a lease from 1851, and in the lease it tells us the nature of the tenure, that the occupiers were leasing the land based on a lease going back to 1800, 51 years earlier. And they leased 2 dwelling houses, and they were leased for the lives of the person who took the lease, William Kearney, and Joseph Kearney, who's a brother of William. And then it goes on to say that there's another Joseph Kearney, is his son to the said William. So in this case, we're finding further generations within the family. The parish registers for that area were missing for this period, so this allowed us to bring the family back another generation, and so on back much further into the early 18th century. The records are also wonderful because they have beautiful maps of the estates, and these maps are often unavailable in any other way. So as I was saying, those landed estate court records are exclusive to Findmypast. They're one of the many exclusive record sets you will only find on Findmypast relating to Irish family history. The other major area that the administration in Ireland was obsessed with was security, as a consequence of which Ireland has much greater quantity of court records and prison records. So if you think I'm casting aspersions about your ancestors being always in the courts or always being in prison, take a moment to think. There were twice as many courts in Ireland, twice as many people went through the court system in Ireland, the police service was considerably more extensive in Ireland, and the prison system was far more extensive in Ireland. It's probably accurate to say that for large parts of the country in the 19th century, it resembled more of a police state. I was probably going a little bit too far, but still in all, the level of security was much more extreme than what you would have found in England or in Wales or even Scotland at the same time. As a consequence of which, there's far more records. Now, what are they? Well, I want to start by talking about the smallest court, the local court in Ireland, the magistrate court. Well, if you're in the US or if you're in Britain, the magistrate courts still exist, and they are still the lowest court in the land. In Ireland, we got rid of them in 1922 after independence, and we replaced them with a broader district court. But these magistrate courts, they're originally called the petty sessions courts. They go way back into the medieval period. In Ireland, they were formally established by statute in 1827, even though they've been around for a while. But by that point, they were required to keep proper records. And mandatory record keeping exists from 1851. Now, these courts dealt with both criminal and civil law, and in fact, most of the records are actually just disputes between neighbours. They're not actually criminal cases. There's a picture there on your right-hand side, which is a pen and ink sketch from the London Satirical magazine, which actually was teasing the Irish for being so litigious in court. And yes, there's a bit of classic sort of anti-Irish bigotry being displayed there, but there's some truth to it as well. The Irish love their day in court. They love and they're actually the second most litigious group of people in the world, I believe. The most litigious would be their descendants on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. But the important thing here is there are 22 million court records that survive up to the 19-teens. Now, to put that in context, there are only 16 million birth, marriage, and death records for the same period. So there's more court records than BMD records. So this is why I'm so excited about this record set. And on Findmypast, we have a full selection of all the images that survive for these records for all of the country, including a full name index. Now, here's an image of what a petty sessions court, a magistrate court, looks like. And on the right-hand side, you'll see the judge, the magistrate, sitting behind his big desk. Now, the magistrate, in most cases, was usually the local landlord. He was the justice of the peace. And the local landlord actually acted as judge for no fee. But, you know, that made it a real problem with this system because it made it very partisan, and it meant the local landlord could really impose their will across an entire community. Even the administration realized it was a problem with this. So during the course of the 19th century, they replaced these JPs with paid magistrates to make it a bit more impartial. Now, who else can we see in this picture? On the left-hand side, we have another man sitting by a smaller desk, and he was the recorder of the court, and he's writing in the ledgers that we've digitized and made available online. And who else is in the room? Well, we've got a couple of policemen at the back. You can see them with the hats and the truncheons. And you've got just a collection of the community who are there having their day in court, their disputes, probably a few criminal cases being brought by the police as well. So this is a very useful image of what would look like. And what do the records actually look like? Well, here's an example from Temple Moor in County Tipperary. And it's from 1898. And I'm going to read you out the top case, the top line. It's a case between the complainant, who's a Joanna Maher of Temple Moor, against Patrick Maher of Temple Moor, possibly her brother. I don't know, some other family relative. But it tells you that on the night of the 14th of August 1898 at Temple Moor, the defendant, Patrick, did threaten the life of Joanna, having previously accused her of witchcraft. And it went on to say that the defendant, Patrick, is a dangerous lunatic. Well, you might sit there and go, well, this is a dispute between family members, not to be taken too seriously, and probably very typical. But what happened? Well, the judge agreed that Patrick was not so sound of mind, and he was immediately incarcerated in the local psychiatric institution. This was the law in Ireland right up to the 1950s, and it could be heavily abused by the family. What it meant that any family member could bring another family member to the local court or to the police, and if they agreed, they would be put inside the psychiatric institution without any intervention of a doctor to take a decision on the case. Now, here are other cases from the Petty Sessions Courts. This is down my neck of the woods in Ferns in County Wexford, and we have examples of road nuisances, drunken disorderly behaviour. There's an awful lot of that. An unlicensed dog, and I'll come back to the dogs in a minute. A common assault, people having a fist fight outside a pub on a Saturday night. And you see the names there of the judges in operation, and then also the names of the complainants and the accused. I mentioned the dogs. Well, the dogs are also of great use as well, because these courts had to pay for themselves, and they did so by granting licenses. Now, we're not all that terribly interested in the dogs right yet. Canine genealogy will have its day, no doubt, in the future, but right here, we're interested in these books because of what they tell us about the owners of the dogs. These dog license books go back a long way, back to the 1860s. And as a consequence of which, they give us a little picture of who the names of the farmers were in any given area in the years thereafter. Virtually every farmer had a dog. Every dog had to have a license. So what do these records tell us? Here's an example from Raphoe in County Donegal. Now, if any of you have done County Donegal research, I send my sympathies. It's very hard, and it's very hard because the records don't survive very well. And you'll see why in this image. If you notice, the right-hand side of the image is very badly stained from mold spores and damp. Donegal has a very poor climate. It's very wet, and it means that records don't survive very well. In fact, you could say the same for the entire western seaboard of Ireland. But this dog license book dates from 1867, and it gives you the names of all of the farmers, where they live, and what dog they've actually got licensed. Now, this is a good 10 years before the surviving parish registers from the same area, so you can see why it's valuable in getting back earlier than the parish registers will let you. And when you get really lucky, this is an example of a dog license register from Mount Rath. On the very far right-hand side, we've got the names of the dogs too, so you'll actually know the name of the family pet. Now, being a little bit more serious, let's move on to the prisons. I mentioned that we had an awful lot more of them than most places in Europe, and that's very true. In fact, we had as many as 100,000 people going through the prison system every single year in the 19th century. And we've digitized and indexed all the prison records that survive up to 1924. And there are 2.7 million prisoners recorded across them. Now, of course, some of them are the same people, but mostly they're not. The number of reoffenders is very low. So you can get an idea of how heavily policed the country was. Now, these records are wonderfully useful because they tell you so much. So you may think they're, oh, my ancestors weren't in prison. Well, you really want to wish they were, because when they were, lots of records survive. The truth is that people with assets or money and people who broke the law are the best to have in your family tree because they leave lots of records. Now, this typically is a register for prisoners here. You get their name, the date they were admitted, you get their height, their age, their weight, their hair color, their eye color, their complexion, the place they were born, their last known residence, the name and address of their next of kin. You'll also, if we zoom in a bit here, I'll just do another slide, you'll actually find out on the right-hand side page what they were convicted of and what they were put in prison for. And if you look right in the very middle of that page, you'll notice a gentleman there was imprisoned for assaulting a lady called Ellen Meha of Kappa in County Waterford. So now we've got the names and addresses of victims too, and all of these have been indexed on our website too. So don't just think it's about criminals. We have all the next of kin indexed as well. Here's another example from Mountjoy, one of the big prisons in Dublin City. And if you look at the top line, I don't know if you can read it, but let me read it out to you. It's for a Bridget Coughlin, who's aged 56. She's 5 foot and 1 inch tall. She's barely 100 pounds in weight, so she's a slight little lady. We find out that she was born in Clane in County Kildare, and that she's living in the Rialto cottages on the South Circular Road. That's not very far from where I live, out towards the west of the city. It also goes on to say that her next of kin is Thomas Coughlin, who also lives in Rialto cottages. And she was given 1 month's imprisonment for assaulting Thomas Coughlin. So this is a domestic dispute which ends up in a prison sentence. Not something that so commonly happen today. So when you look at prison records, bear in mind that the types of reasons why people get imprisoned can sometimes very, very minor offences. If you look down that list of offences on that page, you'll find 2 or 3 people who are imprisoned for using offensive or bad language. So there's a great deal of careful policing of the population. That's good news for genealogy. I'm going to finish by showing you another really unusual prison record. Now, it's not really a prison record, but the prison system had a fairly broad remit. And in the 1880s, they set up an inebriate reformatory. This was a reformatory for incurable alcoholics. Now, once again, you may think that you won't find people here, but you could only wish that you do. Now, the example here, these 2 pages relate to one person, a lady called Ellen Brennan, who's 32 years old, who went into Ennis State Reformatory. And it gives you a full history of her life. It tells you about her family history. And also on the left-hand side page, it tracks her over time through the police service. They keep an eye on her after she's been let out of here. Now, her story is tragic. She was reared in the workhouse. She became an alcoholic at a very young age. She drifted through petty criminality, prostitution. She had a number of children. And it's a really sad story. I'm not going to go into it here. But it does remind you that every single one of these cases we look at are real lived, real lives, with tragedy, with hardship, with challenge. But that is the nature of family history, is it not? In Ireland, when I give a lecture about family history and court and prison records, the one thing everybody desperately wants to find is a rebel in their ancestry. And there's lots of them too, in the prison records particularly, but also in other records too. And this is an example from the Kilmainham prison, and this has the record for the incarceration and execution of Robert Emmet, who led the failed rising at the beginning of the 19th century. But if you look at the list there, you'll notice all the other people who were convicted of rebellion as well, all his compatriots who also ended up meeting the same end. There is a large body of information about those who were involved in many different rebellious activities during the 19th century, including right up to and including the War of Independence in the 19-teens. So if you're looking for that, you'll find it there too. Now, these court and prison records are exclusive to Findmypast. You won't find them anywhere else. Now, let's get on to the things we normally think of as being the core record sets for genealogy, because we have lots of them too. In fact, we've got an awful lot more of them, you will have noticed, with our release of Catholic parish registers, which I'll talk about in a bit. But we have some good records for births, baptisms, marriages, deaths, burials, and so on. And I want to tell you a little bit about them. First of all, the Irish Civil Register of Births, Deaths and Marriages starts in 1864 for all births, all marriages and all deaths. It also goes back to 1845 for non-Catholic marriages. And I could give you a whole lecture about why that is, but just for the moment today, just bear in mind that if you're looking at marriages, push yourself back a bit to the 1840s, because it covers a very large breadth of the population who weren't Catholic. As I often try and remind people, in 1841, 37.5% of the country were not recorded as Catholic. Now, what we tried to do with this, our index to the civil registration records, because we don't have the only index online, we've tried to add details to it to make it more useful for your research. For example, civil registration is by civil registration district. Now, we've tried to describe what districts existed for what county. The previous example of a record we're looking at was in Listowel. So here's Listowel. Oh, it's in County Kerry. That's useful. What we've also done is we've created a map of these registration districts. And you'll notice that here's Listowel down in the southwest of Ireland, in the north of County Kerry, and you can see all the boundaries. Now, the reason why we felt this is really important is that well over half the civil registration districts cross county boundaries. That means they're quite confusing for a novice to try and get to grips with. So this will, I hope, help you all. Here, another thing we've done with the marriages is we've introduced a marriage finder. Now, you ask yourself, what is this? Well, our index purely tells you the registration districts, the date, the volume, and the page number, and that's all we have for each name. But what we can take for certain is that if a woman's name appears on a page and we know she got married, she must have got married to one of the men's names who appear on that page. And so in this case here, it's an 1890 marriage of Mary Gorman. We know from looking at the green bar in the middle that she married Robert Scanlon or John Defane. Here's another example from a little earlier, 1870, and here are the 4 different men in the green slash which she may have married. This helps in identifying you've got the right record, so when you actually decide to go to the General Register Office in Ireland or contact them, you'll know that you've actually got the right record to look for. That marriage finder again is exclusive to Findmypast. Now, you've probably heard, and if you haven't, well, you're in for a big treat. Last week, we published online, for free, a full index to all of the Catholic parish registers. You may not have known, but last summer, the National Library of Ireland released online for free all their images of Catholic parish registers, which go back to the 1670s. And they released all of these 390,000 images online, but what they didn't have is an index. So what we did is we went through every single page and we transcribed all the baptisms, all the marriages, and all the other records. And we ended up with 10.6 million records. As I said, they date back to 1670, right up to 1900, and they cover virtually all the parish registers in the country, 97% of them all. And it's all 32 counties, Northern Ireland and the Republic. And it has been said, and I will repeat it again here, it is the most important source for Irish family history prior to the 1901 census, another source that we also have on our site, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, why are they can be really useful, but also a bit challenging for most people, because a lot of them are written in Latin. You've got to remember Latin was the official language of the Catholic Church. In fact, the Mass was spoken in Latin until Vatican II in the 1960s. So a lot of these are recorded in Latin. And when they're not recorded in Latin, they're recorded in English. It's one truism that parish registers are never recorded in Irish, even though Irish was the majority spoken language for the entire western half of Ireland for the 19th century. Let's have a look and see what these look like, because these are wonderfully valuable. This is a parish register from the 1820s, and you can see all the events are listed here. The names of the people are all given, and typically for a baptism you'll get the name of the child, the names of both parents, and the names then of their sponsors, what we call today godparents. This is very useful to have all this information, because you can start building community profiles, and you can start tracking then all the relationships that exist across the community. With the marriages, of course, typically you get both of the parties' names, husband and wife. You sometimes get their parents' names, but you also always get their witnesses or sponsors to the marriage. And all of this information is available online, and the best news about it is that it's going to be free forever on Findmypast. Now, if you don't think that's good enough, get you much more exciting things to think about. We also digitize from scratch original parish registers of all denominations when we can get hold of them. Now, an image here in front of you is of a Church of Ireland parish register for the parish of Anaclone in County Down. Now, this parish is significant because all the denominations, Catholic, Church of Ireland, which is Episcopalian if you're from North America, and it's also the same as the Church of England if you're from Britain, and also the Presbyterian Church in the area, all gave us their registers to digitize and index and put online. And we're increasingly getting individual parishes which are doing projects like this. That was the Church of Ireland Parish Register. This, however, is wills. Now, I mentioned before that wills are another important evidence of death, and they're a very important resource for family history. In Ireland, we lost a lot of our wills in 1922, but thankfully we had a lot of indexes and transcripts of these wills. And what we have now online is the largest collection of indexes and transcripts of the wills that did survive in 1922. And these are all available on our website now. I mentioned that we have we've increasing numbers of marriage records as well on our site, and much more besides. Census records, which if you're from Britain or North America, you know how important census records are. This is the big missing bit in Irish genealogy, to be honest with you, and this is why it makes it difficult, is you don't have that easy set of every 10 years having a census record which can allow you to track your family with ease. But we do have some. It's quite exciting what we've actually managed to place online so far, because many of you may be familiar with the 1901 and 1911 census, and we have them on our site. You can see how far the population had declined since the famine. Prior to the famine, we had 8 million people in Ireland. After the famine, we had 6. And by 1901, there was only 4.3 million people in the country, north and south. So the population had declined hugely. We're back to about 6 million people north and south now. But what we found, working with the National Archives, is that an awful lot of census records did actually survive the 1922 explosion, particularly records from 18, 21, 31, 41, and 51. There were also other sources we discovered which allowed us to rebuild the 1841 and 51 census. And I want to describe some of these to you, because so far we've managed to get 650,000 records from those missing census returns online, which is only a fraction of the totality, but it's still pretty important. Here's an example of an 1821 census return for the Aran Islands, out in the west coast of Ireland. This is for Inisheer, the smallest of the Aran Islands. And it's a full name census. So can you imagine if that had survived in full today? You know, Irish genealogy would be the easiest in the world. As it is, it's still pretty good. Unfortunately, the 1821 census, it survives very well for County Cavan, but scrappily for anywhere else. And here's the 1831 census. If you're fortunate enough to have ancestors from Derry, or Londonderry as it's sometimes called, you'll find you've got a almost complete survival rate for the 1831 census. Lucky you. For the 1841 census, again, it survives quite well for County Cavan and a few other areas. And again, the 1841 census is a full name census in Ireland. But the great thing about the 1841 census is it also recorded who was missing on the night of the census, if they were somewhere else, and who had died since the last census. Now, the missing people were usually emigrants, people who had left the country. And the deaths are really interesting, but of course it's such a shame so little of this actually survives. 1851, our next image here, it also survives quite well for little bits of the country, parts of County Antrim, County Galway, and a few other counties as well. And again, that also recorded deaths and changes since the previous census. Now, what we've been trying to do is find sources to replace the 1841 and 51 census. And there is a really important set of resources called the Pension Census Search Forms. Now, this is a bit of a mouthful, so what does that mean? Well, in 1907, Ireland brought in a pension. The pension was a pittance. It was tiny, but for a population who were as poor as the Irish, a pittance was better than nothing. You had to prove you were 70. Now, that's a difficult thing to do when civil registration of births, deaths, and marriages only starts in 1864. So how could you prove you were 70? Well, what they did is they allowed you to actually carry out a search of the 1851 or 41 census and have a certified copy of the search, or to do a search of the extensive range of Church of Ireland parish registers that were in the Public Record Office. So the Public Record Office carried out these searches, and these searches survive. So what we've done is we've digitized them. We've digitized all the information about the people who applied for these searches and about all the results that came back from them. And there are over 150,000 names coming back, 130,000 from the census search forms and 20,000 from the parish register search forms. And all of these images and indexes are online exclusively at Findmypast. Here's an example from the 1911 census, the most complete census we have. It's an example actually for, and rather topical for the time of it is, this is the example for the family of James Connolly, one of the signatories of the 1916 proclamation and one of the leaders of the 1916 rising who was executed in May. So you'll find out all the information about him and his family here. But of course it covers the entire country. and this is available online at Findmypast for free. Yes, I said for free. Quite a lot of our Irish records are online for free. So even if you aren't a paying registered user, you should register on the site and go and see how much Irish research you can do for free on our site. Now, we've got a lot more records. I don't know how much more time I have to speak, so I'll run through these quickly. These are the records I'd like to look at now before we look at a couple of things at the end. Let's start with newspapers. Well, we have the largest collection of historic newspapers online for Ireland, over 111 newspaper titles, with 300,000 issues and 2.5 million pages. Newspapers are one of the most underutilized but most important resources for family history. Every town and village, well, every town in the country had at least one newspaper, just like the US, I suppose, and in Britain too. There's a plethora of newspapers, and they're really important in recording the day-to-day activities of the local community. So these are all available online at Findmypast. What else do we have? This is an example, actually, of the Dublin Evening Mail. I pulled this out, actually, for a talk I gave in Salt Lake City at RootsTech earlier this year, because it's a newspaper from Dublin in the 1850s recounting the goings-on in Salt Lake City in the 1850s. So Ireland was an integral part of the British Empire at the time, as a consequence of which it was a very global environment where information came in from all over the world and was recorded in our local newspapers. It's not an isolated place. Immigration or emigration records. These exist in entirety in Ireland from 1890 onwards. From 1890 we have this set of ship's passenger lists which were recorded for all of Britain and Ireland. And they cover all of Ireland up until 1922 and Northern Ireland only from 1922 onwards. For some reason the independent Irish state didn't continue recording them. But they're wonderfully useful and they go back a bit earlier than the Ellis Island records in the US. We also have the largest collection online of directories. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, directories are sort of like your commercial, well, you have yellow pages, golden pages, which you look for people who provide commercial services in your local area. These were produced in Ireland from the early 1800s onwards, and they can be very useful in trying to give you an idea of who's living in the urban areas and who are the people living in the village network in the country. And we have the largest collection of Irish directories at Findmypast. We also have the largest collection of British military records on Findmypast, and this is really important because the Irish were a big, large chunk of the general recruits in the British Army, particularly after the Napoleonic Wars when Catholics were allowed to join the British Army, or earlier actually in the East India Company Army as well. But they're extremely valuable in actually allowing you to peer back into an earlier period of Irish history. Those two images you're looking at there are records from the Royal Hospital Kilmainham, the place where pensions were paid in Ireland to veterans. We also have a growing collection of records relating to rebellion. As I said before, Ireland has had many, many rebellions in its history, most of them unsuccessful, and there's a great deal of records around them. This is a wonderful image from the American Commission in Ireland's account in 1921 of what was going on in Ireland during the War of Independence. And some of the photographs are quite extraordinary for a time when photography was of poor quality in general. But these military and rebellion records are exclusively available in Findmypast. You won't find anything like them anywhere else. We have a very large collection of electoral registers. Most recently we published all the electoral registers for County Clare in the west of Ireland. And they're again very useful for tracking heads of households, particularly for men, but then again women were able to vote in Ireland from 1898 in local elections, as long as they were aged over 30. Wouldn't want to let any younger people in that vote. But women, interestingly enough, in Ireland got the first right, one of the first rights to vote in national elections after independence. So that's an interesting in itself, and we're putting more and more electoral registers online. Here's some examples of them here. Now, one of the biggest things that we're working on right at the moment is trying to document the poor in Ireland. As many of you probably know, the poor were the most likely to emigrate. They're the ones you're most likely trying to track. They're also very difficult to find because they didn't own anything, therefore they had few reasons to leave records. So this is a priority for us to try and track these people. And there are a number of ways we can do it. Earlier last year, we released online for the first time ever the Irish Poverty Relief Loans. And this is a set of records developed from the 1820s. It was a microloan scheme to try and help the quote-unquote industrious poor. Both men and women were eligible. They had to be aged over 21, and the loans were made for 12 months, and you had to pay back weekly. And the loans were for about £1 or £1.50, £1.10, sometimes as much as £2 or £3 even. But they're very small amounts of money, and it's a very similar type of system that you find often in use today in parts of the third world, where we're trying to actually encourage industry by giving microloans. Same system was being used here. The microloans were aimed at very poor areas in Ireland, mostly out towards the western seaboard. There's a map here which will show you the regions covered by these loans. Now, why am I so interested in these loans? Because we're not really interested in the financial history per se, but the actual records themselves tell you a great deal about the people who got them. And because they were very poor, we very rarely find more information about them. So let me take you on one case study to give you an idea of why they're useful. This is an example for Richard Allen. He was a labourer from Keelfadoe, which is down in the southwest of County Cork. And he got a loan of £1.10 on the 16th of May in 1846, just before the famine. And you can see his name there. He's also got two sureties. People guarantee he's going to pay his money back. And none of them can read or write. Do you see they all sign with an X in the middle of their name? And they're all from the area. Richard Allen, you've got William Melville there, and Theo Sweeney. Now, what happened? Well, this is a repayment ledger for that area. Now, probably difficult for you to make out Richard Allen, but he's actually the fourth last individual on that page with a smudge on his last name. But you'll notice that each week he's got nothing written into it, so he hasn't been paying his money back. So what happened to him? Well, this is an account of where things stood in 1848. And if we zoom into the top line, we'll find out what happened. It tells you that Richard Allen resided there as a poor labouring man, but a bad character. And he was transported at the Skibbereen Sessions at the court in May 1847 for sheep stealing. So he's been transported to Australia for sheep stealing in 1847. Well, that's interesting. Well, interestingly enough, the county clerks went round to all of these locations in the 1850s to find out what had happened to everybody who'd received a loan, whether the loans were granted in the 1830s or 40s or at any time. And these are really valuable. Now, I'm going to give you the example relating to Richard Allen. I don't know if you can read it. He's number 4 on the list. And we get the same information that we heard before, that he was transported for sheep stealing in 1847. The next guy on the list, Dennis Bryan, he also got a loan in 1846. And he goes on to say that he was very poor and he lived there in poor circumstances as an agricultural labourer. Then he goes on to say he died of starvation in 1846. So he's a victim of the famine. There are 14 people listed on this page. 2 of them get transported for sheep stealing. 6 of them emigrate to either Britain or North America, and the rest are dead. And they're all listed here. This is why this record set's so important. It actually opens the door, or lifts the veil, on the absolute tragedy of the famine and the extraordinary degree of death and destitution that it brought to the Irish population. We have a lot more records about the poor, and this is really important again. I told you how many emigrated in the last record. The records of the poor law. Do you remember I talked about Griffith's valuation as being this rates, this tax system for paying for this new social welfare system? Well, one of the key parts of that social welfare system, as rudimentary and basic as it was, and it wasn't great, but it was a lot better than nothing, was they built workhouses. Now, they did a lot more than just building workhouses, but workhouses are what we're interested in here. And what we've been going on is a campaign to try and digitize the records of the workhouses, and also the records of their governing body, the Board of Guardians, because the Board of Guardians dealt with individual cases on a daily basis throughout the late 19th century. And the map on your right tells you all of the workhouse, what they call the poor law unions. These were the districts that actually each had a workhouse. So there was 160 workhouses in Ireland, a lot of them. So this is a big project. We're going to be doing this for quite a while. So far we've done all of Dublin, County Dublin, and we're working on Sligo and Clare, and we've got other counties coming on stream soon too. Why are these records so important? Well, here's some images from a workhouse. In the top left-hand corner is an image from the women's section of a workhouse. You can see everybody who came in wore uniform. They were fed collectively. Men and women were separated into different areas of the workhouse. It was a fairly regimented and fairly difficult life to live in a workhouse. But you know what? It was a lot worse, a lot better than what was happening outside. There's an image on your right-hand side here, which is a sketch of what the scene was outside of workhouse during the famine. People were desperate to get inside, and the workhouses simply couldn't cope. They were nowhere near big enough to cope with something as massive as the Irish famine. And so many people were actually literally expiring, dying outside the door without being able to get in. The records themselves are very informative about the people who got into the workhouses. You're given their name, you're given their age, you're given their marital status, occupation details, their religion. Gosh, the records are so obsessed with what people's religion was. But you'll notice even on this record here, this is from Sligo, that 2 of the first 4 people here aren't Catholic. And I think I'm trying to emphasize this to you. Don't assume anything about your ancestry. The non-Catholic population was very large historically in Ireland, and they covered every social class. So they were had as much information in these records about them as there are about the people you might expect to find there. And then we'll find as well what happened to them when they got into the workhouses. You remember I told you that the men and women in the workhouses were separated? Well, here's an extraordinary record, and there's many of these like this. These are marriages within the workhouses, because however it happened, love could flourish within the workhouse, and many of the inmates did actually get married, and they're recorded in the Border Guardian Minute Books. The Border Guardian Minute Books are wonderfully informative about individual case stories and give you a huge amount of information about the lived reality of the lives of the people who are there. So if you haven't looked at these records, I strongly urge you to go and do so. So what's next? Well, I know I've been talking now for quite a while, so I want to wrap up quickly here, but I want to give you a sneak peek at what we're going to be releasing next. The Quaker Archive. Now, many of you out there are thinking, well, Quakers, there aren't many Quakers in Ireland. That's true, there aren't very many Quakers in Ireland today. Why? Because they all left. All the Irish Quakers, of which there were many in the past, most of them left to North America particularly, but also many went to Britain too. The Quakers, if you've never researched Quakers, are the most avid record keepers of any denomination I've ever come across. So you have a real treat in store if your ancestry were Quakers. They keep records, and their records are comprehensive back to the 1660s in Ireland, so they're really wonderful, with births, marriages, burials, sufferings, lists of bad things that had happened to them, migration, disownment, minutes. And even if you think your ancestor wasn't a Quaker, well, I'm going to tell you some interesting information about that when we get onto the marriage records, so let's have a quick look at these. Here's a birth record. It gives you lots of details and information about individual birth of somebody. Again, what you'd expect to find. The next image here, we have the minutes. We've indexed all of the minutes. Now, every Quaker meeting actually had monthly meetings where they would actually record detailed minutes about the things that were going on in their local community. We've name indexed all of this information. So we're not just dealing with typical BMDs, it's all the records being kept by the entire community. More here. Remember I talked about the sufferings? Well, the Quakers felt it was very important to keep a record of all the reasons why they'd had a hard time. And they had plenty of arguments and reasons why they should say they had a hard time. But many of the reasons recorded were because they were being forced to pay local tithes, the religious tax to support the Episcopalian Church of Ireland. And while it's understandable they might have found that annoying, it also did help pay for local administration as well. But at the same time, there are many other things which were sufferings, bad things that happened to them, and they're all recorded in meticulous detail on a year-by-year basis, as you can see here. These are all indexed too on our site, or will be, I should say. And then we also have these wonderful records of removals, people moving from one meeting to another. And of course, typically they're moving maybe from a meeting in Ireland to another meeting in Ireland, but often they're moving from a meeting in Ireland, or as in this case here, to a meeting in Philadelphia. So you'll be able to track exactly where somebody came from and exactly where they went to. Here are more examples of meetings, very detailed records. Now, I mentioned the marriages. Well, the reason why I mentioned the marriages if your ancestors weren't Quakers is, I'll explain here. Here's a marriage between Thomas Middleton and Mary Harris. And it gives you all the typical information you expect to find, even if it's a bit more detailed about their parents and where they come from and their occupations, and it tells you when they got married. And I've underlined these things in red. But at the bottom of the page, it gives you the names of everybody who attended the wedding, because these were all witnesses. Now, not all of these were going to be Quakers. They could be neighbors, friends. They could be of any denomination. So this is an information which is really valuable to you. Now, to make it more exciting, many of the names of witnesses gave their date of birth on these documents, and they're also included. So great stuff to be had. The other major collection that we're working on are the records from 1916 and the War of Independence. As you may or may not know, this year is the 100th anniversary of the 1916 rebellion, the famous Easter Rising, which played such an important role in modern Irish history. What we're trying to do is uncover records which have not been looked at before. We've worked quite closely with the military archives in Ireland, and we've published already online the 1922 military census, and we will be publishing more material that they have on their website and our website. But we've also initiated a project which will be published next month, documenting the records of martial law in Ireland. As many of you may or may not know, between 1916 and throughout the War of Independence, Ireland was under martial law. That basically meant the army controlled all matters in Ireland, all justice. The country was put down in lockdown, basically. And here are examples of posters from that period when the army was in control of all aspects of the country. But the army also kept detailed records. It's one of the great things about the Brits. They keep better records than most countries. And it's wonderful. We can use them for our own family history. So what do these records look like? Here's an example of a court-martial register entry from the War of Independence. And this one's quite useful. It's for John Conovan, who was actually given 2 weeks hard labour at the military tribunal. And why? Well, they describe why. The military went to the courthouse in Castlecomer to post up notices. Some 20 civilians were near it. They were ordered to hands up, and all complied except the accused, who rushed at the party in a ferocious manner, saying, "I defy the military." And he was then shot in the leg, and then he was given 14 days hard labour. So this is wonderfully evocative, very informative. Also, the army were involved in search and raids. Basically, any time anything happened that they felt was wrong, they would cordon off an area and search every house. And again, they kept wonderful records of it. So what do these search and raid reports look like? Here's an example from Rathmines, just in the suburbs of Dublin, where they raided the house of Thomas Farrell and his wife and his children Kathleen, Rachel, Bridget and Mary Farrell. All names are given. They tell you the occupation of Thomas. He's a builder and a bricklayer. And it goes on to say that he was accused of being a Sinn Féiner and being involved in the rebellion. Well, he was eventually arrested and taken away. Other records which are similar. Here's an example of another search and raid report, which is also extremely informative, which will tell you all about the entire family who are living in Kaplan and Ishteag in County Kilkenny. And there you have a full list of the family. I don't know if you can read it there, but we have Mrs. Hanrahan Senior, who's the mother of Thomas Hanrahan, who's a farmer. That tells you where they're born. And it tells you the relationship to each other. We've got Mrs. Walsh, who's a sister, so an aunt, I assume, of Thomas Hanrahan. We've got sisters, Margaret Hanrahan, and so on, Bridget Hanrahan, and then we've got a bunch of other people, brothers who are there, and then a bunch of other people, labourers and people who happen to be there, a little bit more suspicious, as we'll discover if you read the rest of that report. You find out that, in fact, this had been a meeting of a local rebel unit. So wonderfully informative documents. These will all be online on the 24th of April on the 100th anniversary of the 1916 Rising. We've also got a ton more records coming out from the National Archives, including valuation office field and house books. These things predate Griffith's valuation. The merchant marine records. Ireland was a big maritime nation. The surviving wills, remember I told you many were destroyed? Well, many survived. We're publishing them all online. Full transcript, not just transcripts, full scans of all the wills. Catholic qualification rolls, and many, many more records. I could give many, many more discussions about all the exciting things we have coming up. But I think the key thing I'd like to get across to everybody there is the reason why Findmypast is the #1 resource for Irish family history is because we're here in Ireland, and we're doing partnerships with all the major cultural institutions here, the National Archives, both in Dublin, the National Archives in London, all the county archives, and we have a very special position in making this available for your use to make your family history possible. And I hope that we can make Irish family history finally easy. Now, thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions and dealing with them over the coming while. Thank you very much. Bye.